The crystalline spires of Vaelthera gleamed under the light of three suns, their ethereal beauty masking the weight of impending doom that pressed down upon the ancient city. High Priestess Lyralii stood at the balcony of the sacred tower, her luminescent blue skin catching the ambient light as she gazed across the vast expanse of her dying world. Her people, the Vaeltheri, had ruled this galaxy for millennia with their advanced technology and near-immortal lifespans, but now they faced extinction at the hands of the Crovathan Empire. The Crovathan were a plague upon the stars, a species of mechanical beings who consumed worlds and converted their populations into soulless drones. They had already devoured 17 systems in the Outer Rim, and their massive fleets now darkened the space around Vaelthera's home system. Traditional warfare had proven futile against their adaptive technology and overwhelming numbers. High Priestess, came a melodious voice behind her. Lyralii turned to see her advisor, Thessarian, approaching with careful steps. His normally composed demeanor showed cracks of worry. The Council of Ancients has reached a decision regarding the unconventional proposal. Lyralii's heart, which beat once every 30 seconds in the Vaeltheri way, seemed to flutter with uncertainty. The proposal was indeed unconventional, a political marriage to secure an alliance with humanity, a species so young that many Vaeltheri considered them barely evolved beyond primitive warfare. Yet humanity had something the Vaeltheri desperately needed: recent victory against the Crovathan in the Sol system. And their decision? She asked, though she already suspected the answer from Thessarian's expression. They have approved the union, High Priestess. The human delegation awaits your presence in the Harmony Chamber. Lyralii closed her eyes and drew upon the ancient meditation techniques of her people. She was 847 years old, considered young by Vaeltheri standards, but she had dedicated her entire existence to the pursuit of peace and knowledge. The idea of binding herself to a creature who would age and die within a single Vaeltheri century seemed like a cruel joke from the universe. Yet if it could save her people, she would make any sacrifice. The Harmony Chamber lived up to its name, with walls that hummed with soft energy and floors of polished stone that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the planet itself. The human delegation stood at the center, looking remarkably composed despite being in the presence of beings who could manipulate matter at the molecular level. Ambassador Sarah Chun stepped forward, her weathered face bearing the marks of someone who had seen too many battles. Behind her stood 3 other humans, but Lyralii's attention was immediately drawn to the man who would become her husband. Marcus Reed was tall by human standards, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that showed premature streaks of gray and eyes the color of Earth's oceans. His bearing was that of a soldier, though he wore civilian diplomatic attire. High Priestess Lyralii, Ambassador Chen began, her voice carrying the weight of formality. Allow me to present Captain Marcus Reed of the Human Defense Force. As agreed upon in our negotiations, he will serve as your consort and the symbolic bridge between our peoples. Marcus stepped forward and executed what Lyralii recognized as a human military salute before offering a more civilian bow. When he spoke, his voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite identify. It's an honor to meet you, High Priestess. I want you to know that I understand the gravity of this arrangement and the sacrifice you're making for your people. Lyralii studied him with senses far beyond human perception. She could detect the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the chemical signatures of his emotions, and the electromagnetic patterns of his neural activity. What surprised her was the absence of deception or resentment. Instead, she sensed determination, a deep well of protective instinct, and something else, a darkness kept carefully controlled, like a blade kept sheathed. The honor is mine, Captain Reed, she replied, her voice carrying harmonics that would sound musical to human ears. Though I must confess, I know little of human customs regarding marriage. A slight smile crossed Marcus's features. In our culture, marriage is ideally based on mutual respect and partnership. I hope that, given time, we might achieve something approaching that, even under these circumstances. The formal ceremony was brief by Vaeltheri standards, lasting only 14 hours. Ancient rituals were compressed and modified to accommodate the vast differences between the species. Lyralii bound herself to Marcus through the sacred Vaeltheri rite of soul touching, a process that created a permanent empathic link between them. The sensation of suddenly feeling another being's emotions and thoughts flowing alongside her own was overwhelming, like trying to drink from a waterfall. Through the link, She experienced Marcus's mind for the first time. His thoughts moved differently than hers. Faster, more chaotic, driven by urgency rather than the measured contemplation of her people. But, beneath the surface chaos, she found something unexpected, a strategic mind that processed information with startling efficiency, and a moral compass that pointed unwaveringly toward protecting others, even at the cost of personal suffering. The first 3 weeks of their union passed quietly. Marcus adapted to life on Vaelthera with remarkable ease, learning their customs and technology with the same methodical approach Lyralii imagined he applied to military strategy. He was respectful, even considerate, but maintained a careful distance that she found both appropriate and oddly disappointing. Their private quarters in the sacred tower had been modified to accommodate both their needs. Marcus had requested minimal changes, a simple bed designed for human physiology, a small area for physical exercise, and a communication terminal to stay in contact with human command. Lyralii was surprised by how little space he required and how few possessions he seemed to value. The empathic link between them remained mostly dormant during this period. Marcus had remarkable control over his emotions, keeping them carefully contained. When feelings did leak through, they were usually related to his concern for the upcoming conflict or his determination to prove himself worthy of the alliance. Lyralii found herself respecting his discipline while simultaneously wanting to understand the depths he kept hidden. It was on the 21st day that everything changed. Lyralii was in the temple's meditation chamber when the first alarms began to sound. The harmonic tones that indicated an emergency shattered the peaceful atmosphere like broken crystal. Through the empathic link, she felt Marcus's instant transition from calm to battle-ready alertness, his heart rate spiking as adrenaline flooded his system. She found him in their quarters, already donning what appeared to be human military gear that had materialized from storage containers she hadn't known existed. The transformation was startling. Gone was the diplomatic consort, replaced by someone who moved with predatory efficiency. His eyes had changed too, becoming harder, more focused. "What's happening?" she asked, though part of her already knew from the specific pattern of the alarms. "Crovathan advanced scouts," Marcus replied, his fingers dancing over a device she now recognized as military-grade human communication equipment. 3 ships, cloaked until they were already past your outer sensors. They're heading for the primary population centers. Through the link, Lyralii felt his assessment of the situation flowing like rapid-fire data. He was calculating distances, response times, probable Crovathan tactics, and defensive options with a speed that rivaled Vaeltheri computational enhancement. But, more than that, she felt the emergence of something that had been carefully contained since his arrival, a cold, patient fury that was entirely focused on protecting what he had claimed as his. "The defense fleet won't intercept them in time," she said, her own strategic training allowing her to follow his reasoning. "No, they won't." Marcus finished securing his gear and turned to face her. For the first time since their marriage, she saw him completely unguarded. The careful diplomat was gone, revealing the warrior beneath. "I need you to get me to the nearest spacecraft capable of atmospheric flight. You can't possibly be considering engaging them alone. You're one human against 3 Crovathan vessels." Marcus's smile was sharp and entirely without humor. "High Priestess, your people made an alliance with humanity for a reason. It's time I showed you why we won the Soul campaign." The flight to the spaceport took 12 minutes. During the journey, Lyralii watched Marcus prepare for battle with an efficiency that was almost frightening. He interfaced with human tactical systems, uploaded data about Crovathan ship configurations, and ran through what appeared to be dozens of combat scenarios in the time it took her to complete a single thought. "You don't understand," she said as they reached the spaceport. "This isn't like the large-scale battles in Sol. There are no fleets to support you, no coordinated strategy. It's just you against advanced alien technology." Through the empathic link, she felt his response before he spoke it aloud. The emotion that flowed through their connection was complex, part determination, part protective instinct, and, beneath it all, something ancient and primal that spoke of humanity's climb from prey to apex predator. "Lyralii," he said, using her name rather than her title for the first time. "There's something you need to understand about humans. We didn't reach the stars because we were the strongest or the smartest. We made it because we're very, very good at killing things that threaten what we care about." The ship he selected was a Vaeltheri interceptor, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than heavy combat. As Marcus familiarized himself with the controls with disturbing ease, Lyralii realized that this moment would define not just their personal relationship, but the future of the alliance between their peoples. "I'm coming with you," she announced, settling into the co-pilot's seat. "Absolutely not." Marcus's refusal was immediate and non-negotiable. "You're too valuable to risk in combat." "I'm not asking for permission, Captain. This is my world, and those are my people the Crovathin are targeting. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "I'm the only one here who knows how to calibrate Veil Theory weapons systems for optimal anti-Crovathin effectiveness." For a moment, she felt his frustration through the link. Then, surprisingly, something that felt like approval. "Fine. But you follow my orders in combat, no questions asked." As their ship lifted off from Veilthera's surface, heading toward an intercept course with the Crovathin scouts, Lyralii found herself experiencing something she had never felt before in her centuries of existence: anticipation for violence. Through the empathic link with Marcus, she was beginning to understand that humanity's gift wasn't just strategic thinking or technological adaptation. It was the ability to become something terrifying when the things they protected were threatened. The three Crovathin ships appeared on their sensors as dark blots against the star field, their angular forms designed for efficient killing rather than aesthetic appeal. Each was roughly twice the size of their interceptor and equipped with adaptive shielding that could analyze and counter most known weapon types. "There," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone she'd never heard before: calm, cold, and absolutely certain. "Let me show you how humans hunt." As they approached the enemy vessels, Lyralii realized that everything she thought she knew about warfare was about to change. Through their bond, she could feel Marcus's mind shifting into something that was part tactical computer and part predatory instinct. The human she had married for political necessity was about to reveal himself as something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The battle for Veilthera was about to begin, and for the first time since the Crovathin threat had emerged, Lyralii felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. But it was hope tempered with the growing realization that the gentle human diplomat she had wed might be the most effective killer in the galaxy. As their ship accelerated toward the enemy, Marcus began to laugh, a sound with no humor in it at all. The first Crovathin ship died in silence. Lyralii watched in stunned fascination as Marcus guided their interceptor through a series of maneuvers that defied her understanding of physics and tactical doctrine. Instead of engaging the enemy vessels directly, he had used Veilthera's gravity well and the interference from its 3 moons to mask their approach. The Crovathin, confident in their superior numbers and technology, had maintained standard formation patterns, a mistake they wouldn't live to regret. Marcus had struck the trailing vessel without warning, using a combination of Veil Theory plasma weaponry and something he called kinetic penetrators, simple metal rods that he had somehow jury-rigged to fire from their ship's cargo ejection system. The Crovathin's adaptive shields, designed to counter energy weapons, had been completely unprepared for chunks of dense metal moving at relativistic speeds. "How did you know their shields wouldn't stop the penetrators?" Lyralii asked as they wheeled away from the expanding debris field. Through the empathic link, she felt Marcus's tactical analysis flowing like a river of cold calculation. Crovathin technology adapts to threats it recognizes, but their databases are built on encounters with civilized species who fight by established rules. Humans don't fight fair, we fight to win. The second Crovathin ship was already altering course, its scanning arrays working frantically to locate their small interceptor. Lyralii could see the mechanical precision of the enemy vessel's movements, each action optimized for efficiency rather than innovation. It was this predictability that Marcus seemed to be counting on. "They're trying to establish a targeting lock," she reported, monitoring their sensor displays. "Let them." Marcus's voice carried a predatory satisfaction that sent an involuntary thrill through their empathic connection. "I want them confident." What happened next would later be studied by military academies across the galaxy as a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. Instead of attempting to evade the Crovathin's targeting systems, Marcus deliberately flew their ship into the enemy's optimal firing solution. The Crovathin vessel, operating according to its programmed battle protocols, charged its primary weapons and prepared to deliver what should have been a killing blow. At the last possible moment, Marcus activated every single system on their ship simultaneously: engines, weapons, sensors, even the environmental controls. The massive electromagnetic pulse that resulted wasn't an attack. It was an electronic scream that temporarily overwhelmed both ships' systems. But While the Crovathan vessel's automated systems struggled to compensate for the unexpected interference, Marcus was already moving. In the 3 seconds of confusion that followed, he manually fired their plasma cannons using backup targeting systems that bypassed the ship's computer entirely. The shots weren't particularly accurate by Veiltheri standards, but they didn't need to be. Marcus had aimed for the Crovathan ship's sensor array, not to destroy it, but to damage it in a specific way that would create a cascade failure in their adaptive shielding. The third shot punched through the crippled shields and into the enemy vessel's power core. The explosion lit up the space around Veilthera like a new star. 2 down, Marcus said with grim satisfaction. Now for the tricky one. The final Crovathan ship had witnessed the destruction of its companions and was responding with the cold efficiency that made the species so dangerous. It was no longer operating according to standard protocols. Instead, it was adapting, learning from what it had observed, becoming something more dangerous with each passing moment. It's modifying its approach, Lyralii observed, studying the sensor data. The vessel is implementing countermeasures for every tactic you've used. Good, Marcus replied, and through their link, she felt his genuine approval of the enemy's adaptation. I was hoping they would do that. This time, when Marcus altered course, Lyralii began to understand the true depth of his strategy. He wasn't just fighting 3 individual ships, he had been fighting the entire Crovathan tactical database from the beginning. Every action he had taken, every apparently desperate gambit, had been designed to force the Crovathan to reveal their adaptive capabilities while providing false data about human combat doctrine. The surviving Crovathan ship was now operating under the assumption that humans were reckless, technologically primitive fighters who relied on surprise and overwhelming electromagnetic interference to compensate for inferior equipment. It had adapted its systems to counter these perceived weaknesses, hardening its shields against kinetic weapons and installing filters to prevent sensor disruption. Marcus had been counting on exactly this response. Hold on, he said, and their ship suddenly accelerated beyond anything the Veiltheri interceptor was designed to handle. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's absolute confidence in his understanding of both the ship's capabilities and the enemy's expectations. They were moving directly toward the Crovathan vessel now, apparently repeating the desperate charge tactic that had worked against the second ship. The enemy's weapons powered up, its enhanced shields prepared to deflect kinetic penetrators, and its filtered sensors tracked their approach with mechanical precision. None of it mattered. Marcus wasn't planning to attack the Crovathan ship at all. Instead, he was using their interceptor as a delivery system for something far more dangerous, himself. What are you doing? Lyralii demanded as she felt his intentions through their mental link. Something the Crovathan will never see coming, Marcus replied, his hands dancing across controls she didn't recognize. They've studied our fleet tactics, our weapons, our technology. But they've never encountered a human in single combat. The plan that flowed through their empathic connection was insane by any reasonable measure. Marcus intended to use their ship's emergency airlock to literally board the Crovathan vessel. He would be alone, in vacuum, with nothing but a Veiltheri environmental suit and weapons he had somehow acquired during their brief time at the spaceport. That's suicide, Lyralii said flatly. Even if you could somehow reach their ship, Crovathan vessels are designed to repel boarders. The internal defenses alone will kill you in seconds. Marcus's smile was visible in reflection on the cockpit's display screen. Maybe, but I've read every after-action report from the Sol campaign, and I've noticed something interesting about Crovathan psychology. They're very good at adapting to external threats, but they have trouble processing attacks that don't fit their understanding of logical behavior. As they closed the distance to the enemy ship, Marcus began suiting up in Veiltheri combat gear that had been modified with human technology. The environmental suit was standard, but the weapons were something else entirely. Instead of the elegant energy weapons favored by her people, he carried crude but effective human projectile weapons and something he referred to as breaching charges. The Crovathan think in terms of efficiency and logical progression, Marcus explained as he prepared for what seemed like certain death. They can't comprehend why someone would sacrifice themselves for others, because it serves no logical purpose from their perspective. That's their weakness. Through the empathic link, Lyralii experienced the complex mixture of emotions that drove Marcus toward this desperate action. There was fear. He wasn't suicidal, but it was overwhelmed by something far stronger. The protective instinct that had first drawn her attention to his mind had evolved into something primal and absolute. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to ensure that the things he protected would survive, regardless of the cost to himself. The Crowthan ship opened fire when they reached optimal range, its weapons tracking their interceptor with deadly precision. But Marcus was no longer where the enemy expected him to be. He had ejected from their ship during its final approach, using the interceptor itself as a shield while he crossed the killing ground between the vessels. Lyralii watched through the ship's sensors as Marcus somehow navigated the lethal space between the two craft, dodging weapons fire that should have vaporized him instantly. His movements were unlike anything she had ever seen, part tactical calculation, part pure instinct, and entirely human in their refusal to accept defeat. He reached the Crowthan ship. What happened next was recorded by both Veilthari sensors and the enemy vessel's own monitoring systems, though the footage would later be classified by several galactic governments. Marcus didn't attempt to find an airlock or exploit a known weakness in the ship's hull. Instead, he attached his breaching charges to what appeared to be a random section of the outer armor, and then did something that violated every principle of civilized warfare. He used himself as a weapon. When the charges detonated, they created a breach just large enough for a human in an environmental suit to pass through. Marcus entered the Crowthan ship like a force of nature, moving through corridors designed for mechanical beings with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. He wasn't just fighting the ship's automated defenses. He was systematically hunting down and destroying every system that allowed the vessel to function. Through their empathic link, Lyralii experienced the battle from Marcus's perspective. His mind had shifted into something that was barely recognizable as human. Every movement was calculated to maximum effect. Every shot precisely aimed to create cascading failures throughout the ship's systems. He fought like someone who understood that mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford and that hesitation would result in the deaths of millions. But what truly terrified Lyralii was the cold satisfaction that flowed through their connection as Marcus worked his way toward the ship's central command core. He wasn't just destroying the Crowthan vessel. He was enjoying it, not in a sadistic way, but with the deep satisfaction of a predator that had cornered its prey. The Crowthan tried to adapt. Their internal defense systems modified themselves in real time, creating new obstacles and threats to contain the human intruder. But Marcus seemed to anticipate every countermeasure, as if he understood their technology better than they did. Later analysis would reveal that this was exactly what had happened. During his weeks on Veilthara, he had studied every piece of captured Crowthan equipment, learning their design philosophy and identifying critical vulnerabilities. The final battle took place in the ship's command center, where the Crowthan's artificial intelligence made its last desperate attempt to preserve itself. It flooded the chamber with toxic gas, sealed all exits, and activated every remaining defensive system simultaneously. Marcus walked through it all like an avenging angel, his modified Veilthari environmental suit protecting him from the chemical attack, while his weapons systematically dismantled the AI's physical components. When he reached the central processing unit, he didn't simply destroy it. He connected a human data storage device and began downloading the Crowthan's tactical databases. "What are you doing?" Lyralii asked through their communication link, though she could feel his intentions through their empathic bond. "Learning," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the carnage around him. "The Crowthan aren't evil, just programmed to expand and convert. But their databases contain information about every species they've encountered, every world they've conquered, every tactical adaptation they've developed. If I can understand how they think, we can beat them." The download took 17 minutes. During that time, Marcus held the ship's command center against increasingly desperate attacks from the Crowthan's remaining automated systems. He didn't just survive the assault. He used it as an opportunity to test theories about Crowthan psychology and tactics that would later prove crucial in the larger war to come. When the download was complete, Marcus did something that surprised even Lyralii. Instead of simply destroying the ship, he reprogrammed its navigation systems to send it on a course directly into Veilthara's star. The Crowthan vessel would be completely vaporized, leaving no trace of advanced technology for other enemy forces to analyze and adapt to. But, more importantly, the ship's final transmission before its destruction would carry a modified version of the tactical data Marcus had stolen, designed to introduce subtle errors into the Crowthan collective consciousness. It was a virus of sorts, not technological, but psychological, false information that would make the enemy less effective in future encounters. Marcus returned to their interceptor just as the Crowthan ship began its final descent toward the star. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt the complex mixture of emotions that followed his battle high. There was satisfaction at a job well done, exhaustion from the physical and mental demands of combat, and, beneath it all, a deep sadness for the necessity of what he had done. "You're not what I expected," Lyralii said as they returned to Vaelthra. Marcus was cleaning his weapons with the methodical care of a professional soldier. "What did you expect? A diplomat? A politician? Someone who would represent humanity's desire for peace?" She paused, studying his reflection in the cockpit displays. "I didn't expect to marry a war god." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "I'm not a war god, Lyralii. I'm just a human who takes his responsibilities seriously. Your people needed protection, and I gave them my word that they would have it." Through their empathic link, she felt the truth of his statement. Marcus didn't see himself as particularly heroic or exceptional. In his mind, he had simply done what any reasonable person would do when faced with a threat to innocent lives. The fact that his definition of reasonable included single-handedly destroying 3 advanced warships was something he seemed to consider a minor detail. As they approached Vaelthra's atmosphere, Lyralii realized that the political marriage she had agreed to for the sake of her people had become something far more significant. She hadn't just gained a human ally. She had discovered what humanity truly was beneath their diplomatic facade. They were apex predators who had learned to wear the mask of civilization. But when that mask came off, they became something that could make even the Crovathan afraid. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the crisis began, Lyralii believed they might actually win. Not because of superior technology or ancient wisdom, but because they now had something the Crovathan couldn't adapt to, a species that fought not just to survive, but to ensure that the things they cared about would never have to fear again. As their ship touched down at the spaceport, Marcus turned to face her with eyes that still held echoes of the cold fire she had witnessed during the battle. "Tomorrow, we start planning the real war," he said. "And I'm going to show you exactly what humans do to things that threaten our families." The war council that convened 3 days after the destruction of the Crovathan scouts was unlike anything in Vaelthari history. Representatives from 17 different species sat around the ancient table of harmonies, their varied forms creating a tapestry of galactic civilization. Yet all eyes were focused on the human who sat beside High Priestess Lyralii, studying holographic displays with an intensity that made several delegates visibly uncomfortable. Marcus had spent the intervening time analyzing the data stolen from the Crovathan ship, and what he had discovered was both terrifying and illuminating. The enemy wasn't simply an expanding empire. They were a collective consciousness that absorbed the knowledge and capabilities of every species they conquered. Each victory made them stronger, smarter, and more adaptable. "The traditional approach won't work," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the chamber with quiet authority. "Every species here has tried to fight the Crovathan using their own strengths. The Zephyrians with their superior speed, the Thrakkari with their defensive technology, the Selenites with their psychic abilities. All of them lost because they fought the war the Crovathan expected." Ambassador Vextar of the Thrakkari coalition rose from his seat, his crystalline form flickering with agitation. "Human, your success against 3 scout ships is commendable, but you speak of matters beyond your understanding. The Crovathan have absorbed the military knowledge of hundreds of species. They cannot be defeated through conventional means." Through the empathic link she shared with Marcus, Lyralii felt his amusement at the ambassador's dismissal. But what surprised her was the complete absence of offense or ego in his response. Marcus wasn't interested in proving his worth to the council. He was focused entirely on the problem at hand. "You're absolutely right, Ambassador," Marcus agreed, manipulating the holographic display to show the progression of Crovathan conquests. "Conventional means won't work, which is why we're not going to use them." The display shifted, showing a 3-dimensional map of Crovathan territory that made several delegates gasp in shock. Where previous intelligence had suggested a methodical expansion pattern, Marcus's analysis revealed something far more sophisticated, a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to isolate and eliminate specific types of resistance. "The Crovathan aren't randomly conquering systems," Marcus explained. "They're systematically eliminating every species that might pose a long-term threat to their expansion. Look at the pattern. First, they absorbed the hegemony of worlds, gaining their industrial capacity. Then, they took the ethereal domains, acquiring their energy manipulation technology. Each conquest was chosen to complement their existing capabilities." Lyralii watched the assembled delegates process this revelation. Some species represented here were clearly on the Crovathan target list, while others had been ignored not out of mercy, but because they posed no significant threat to the collective's long-term goals. This suggests we have less time than we thought, observed Counselor Yara of the Selenite Confluence, her telepathic voice carrying harmonics of fear. If they are prioritizing threats, then our alliance itself will make us a primary target. Exactly, Marcus said, and Lyralii felt his satisfaction through their bond. He had led the council to this conclusion deliberately, allowing them to reach the logical endpoint of his analysis on their own, which means we can't wait for them to come to us. We have to take the fight to them, and we have to do it in a way they won't expect. What followed was the most intense strategic planning session in galactic history. Marcus presented a battle plan that violated every principle of civilized warfare, incorporating tactics that several species found morally questionable at best. But, as the humans systematically dismantled every objection with cold logic and historical precedent, even the most pacifist delegates began to see the brutal necessity of his approach. "You're talking about asymmetric warfare on a galactic scale," said Admiral Karath of the Hegemony Remnant, his scarred features showing grudging respect. "Hit and run attacks, sabotage operations, psychological warfare. These are the tactics of terrorists and pirates. They're the tactics of species that refuse to become extinct," Marcus corrected. "The Crovathan expect us to meet them fleet to fleet, system to system, fighting by the rules of engagement that allow them to adapt and overcome. Instead, we're going to make them afraid." Through the empathic link, Lyralii experienced Marcus's tactical thinking in real time. His mind processed variables at a speed that rivaled Veil Theory computational enhancement, but with a creative flexibility that no artificial intelligence could match. He wasn't just planning battles. He was designing a psychological campaign to break the Crovathan collective's confidence in its own invincibility. The first phase of the plan required every species to contribute something they had never shared before, their most closely guarded military secrets. Not their standard weapons or defenses, but the experimental technologies and forbidden techniques that they kept hidden from even their allies. Marcus called it arsenal fusion, combining incompatible technologies in ways that would create entirely new categories of weapons. The Crovathan adapt by analyzing and countering known threats, Marcus explained as he outlined the technical requirements. But they can't adapt to weapons that shouldn't exist according to their understanding of physics and engineering. The Veil Theory contributed their matter manipulation technology, normally used only for construction and healing. The Thrakkeray provided their dimensional phase generators, typically reserved for emergency evacuation. The Selenites offered their psychic amplification networks, despite the taboo against using telepathy as a weapon. Each contribution was carefully integrated into Marcus's grand design. But it was the human contribution that truly terrified the assembled delegates. Marcus had brought with him technical specifications for something called relativistic kill vehicles, weapons of such devastating power that their use was considered a war crime by human law. They were simple in concept: accelerate a dense mass to a significant percentage of light speed and point it at a target. The kinetic energy released on impact was equivalent to antimatter weapons, but without the complex technology that the Crovathan could analyze and counter. "These weapons are indiscriminate," protested Counselor Yara. "They could destroy entire worlds." "Yes," Marcus agreed without hesitation. "That's exactly what they're designed to do. But we won't be targeting worlds. We'll be targeting the Crovathan production facilities and fleet staging areas. Strategic strikes that cripple their ability to wage war while demonstrating that we're willing to escalate beyond anything they've encountered before." The debate that followed revealed fundamental differences in how each species approached conflict. The older civilizations, those that had achieved peace through millennia of evolution beyond their violent origins, struggled to accept the necessity of Marcus's approach. The younger species, those still close enough to their predatory roots to understand what survival truly required, began to rally around the human strategic vision. It was Lyralii who finally broke the deadlock. "I understand the moral objections to this plan," she said, rising from her seat with the fluid grace of her people. "But I've experienced human combat psychology through our empathic bond, and I've seen what happens when they fight to protect something they value. The Crovathan have made a fundamental error in their assessment of our capabilities." She manipulated the holographic display to show the recent battle with the scout ships, highlighting Marcus's tactical decisions and their unexpected effectiveness. They believe they understand warfare because they have absorbed the military knowledge of hundreds of species. But they've never encountered a species that treats war not as a competition between civilizations, but as an existential struggle requiring any means necessary to ensure survival. Through their empathic link, Lyralii shared with the Council a filtered version of what the Crovathan core system was, a monument to the collective's vision of perfection. 7 worlds orbited an artificially stabilized star, each planet stripped of its original ecosystem and rebuilt into a massive processing center. Billions of drones moved in perfect synchronization across geometrically precise landscapes, their individual consciousness long ago absorbed into the greater collective mind. Marcus stood before the holographic display on the Alliance flagship's bridge, studying the enemy positions with the focused intensity that Lyralii had come to recognize as his battle state. Through their empathic link, she could feel his mind processing tactical data at superhuman speeds, but there was something different about his mental patterns now. The careful control that had characterized his thinking was beginning to crack, revealing depths of strategic ruthlessness that frightened even her. "Defensive positions are exactly what we expected," reported Admiral Karath, his voice carrying grudging respect for the enemy's preparations. "They've positioned their fleet in a perfect sphere around the primary world, with overlapping fields of fire that cover every possible approach vector. 14,000 ships," added the intelligence coordinator. "Each one adapted with countermeasures for every weapon system we've used in previous engagements. They've been learning from our victories." Marcus nodded, his attention never leaving the tactical display. "Of course they have. The collective doesn't make the same mistake twice." He manipulated the hologram, highlighting specific formations within the Crovathan fleet. "But they're still thinking like a collective consciousness. Perfect coordination, optimal positioning, maximum efficiency. That sounds like a significant advantage," observed Counselor Yara, her telepathic voice carrying undertones of concern. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's cold amusement at the comment. It would be, if they were fighting another collective. But they're not. What Marcus revealed next would later be classified by several alliance governments and studied only by those with the highest security clearances. During the 6 months of preparation for this assault, he hadn't just been coordinating between species. He had been fundamentally reimagining what warfare could become when guided by a mind that refused to accept limitations. The Alliance fleet that approached the Crovathan core system bore little resemblance to anything in the historical record. Instead of traditional ships arranged in recognizable formations, they deployed something Marcus called tactical chaos, a battle doctrine based on the principle that unpredictability itself was a weapon. "Every ship in our fleet is operating under different rules of engagement," Marcus explained as the deployment began. "The Veil Theory vessels are using hit and run tactics designed around their matter manipulation technology. The Thrakkery ships are implementing defensive protocols that will make them nearly indestructible, but limit their offensive capabilities. The Selenite forces are focusing on psychological warfare, trying to disrupt the collective's coordination through psychic interference." "And the human ships?" asked Admiral Karath. Marcus's smile was sharp and entirely without humor. "We're going to do what humans do best. We're going to be completely unreasonable." The battle began not with a coordinated assault, but with what appeared to be random chaos. Alliance ships attacked from impossible angles, using technologies that shouldn't have worked together, implementing tactics that violated every principle of military doctrine. The Crovathan collective, designed to process and adapt to any threat through logical analysis, found itself facing something it had never encountered, an enemy that deliberately embraced illogical behavior. Through the empathic link, Lyralii experienced the battle from Marcus's perspective. His consciousness had expanded beyond its normal human limitations, simultaneously tracking hundreds of individual engagements while maintaining awareness of the larger strategic picture. But what truly terrified her was the growing realization that he was enjoying this. Not the violence itself, but the intellectual challenge of dismantling an enemy that had considered itself invincible. "Crovathan adaptation cycles are falling behind our tactical shifts," reported the Alliance tactical coordinator. "They're attempting to counter the Veil Theory hit and run tactics while the Selenites are already implementing psychic warfare protocols. The collective is experiencing decision paralysis." "Phase 1 complete," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the command bridge. "All units, implement Directive Omega." Directive Omega was something that Marcus had kept classified even from his own allies until this moment. As the order went out across the Alliance fleet, Lyralii watched in horror as their ships began to do something that violated every instinct of self-preservation. They started ramming the Krovathan vessels. But these weren't suicide attacks. Marcus had developed a new type of weapon that used the Alliance ships themselves as delivery systems for something he called recursive viruses, computer programs designed not just to disrupt Krovathan technology, but to rewrite their fundamental programming at the quantum level. Each Alliance ship that made contact with a Krovathan vessel delivered a payload that spread through the enemy's networks like a plague, turning their own adaptive capabilities against them. The collective consciousness that had been the species' greatest strength suddenly became a vulnerability as the viruses propagated through their shared mental network. "My God," whispered Admiral Karath, watching as entire sections of the Krovathan fleet began to turn on each other. "They're fighting themselves. The recursive viruses are exploiting a fundamental flaw in collective consciousness," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the detached tone of a scientist observing an experiment. When every individual mind is linked to a central network, a sufficiently sophisticated attack on that network can turn the collective against itself. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt the complex mixture of emotions that drove Marcus's tactical decisions. There was satisfaction at the success of his strategy, but also a deep sadness at the necessity of what he was doing. More concerning was the growing distance she sensed in his mind, as if part of him was retreating from the horror of what he had become capable of creating. The battle for the Krovathan core system lasted 18 hours, but the outcome was decided in the first 30 minutes. Once the recursive viruses began spreading through the collective consciousness, the enemy's perfect coordination became a cascade of conflicting orders and contradictory imperatives. Krovathan ships fired on their own allies, production facilities shut down their defenses, and, across 7 worlds, billions of drones simply stopped functioning. "They're broadcasting surrender terms," reported the communications officer, her voice carrying disbelief. Marcus studied the incoming transmission, his expression unreadable. "No," he said finally. "They're not surrendering. The collective consciousness is trying to negotiate a merger." The proposal that came through the Krovathan communication channels was unlike anything in military history. The collective offered to share their accumulated knowledge and technology with the Alliance in exchange for being allowed to continue existing as a secondary consciousness within their network. It was, in essence, an offer to become a junior partner in their own defeat. "It's actually not a terrible offer," observed Counselor Yara. "We could gain access to the knowledge of hundreds of conquered civilizations." Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's instant and absolute rejection of the proposal. In his mind, she glimpsed something that chilled her to the core, a vision of what would happen if they allowed any part of the collective consciousness to survive. The Krovathan had become what they were by gradually absorbing other species. Given time, they would find a way to reverse their defeat and begin the cycle again. "Negative," Marcus said, his voice carrying final authority. "We don't negotiate with plagues. All units, implement Final Protocol." Final Protocol was something that several Alliance species had hoped would never be necessary. It was the complete sterilization of the Krovathan core system, using weapons that would render the worlds uninhabitable for thousands of years. The knowledge and technology of hundreds of civilizations would be lost forever, but so would the collective consciousness that had consumed them. "Marcus," Lyralii said quietly, using their private communication channel. "Is this really necessary? They're offering surrender." Through their bond, she felt his absolute certainty. They're offering survival. As long as any part of the collective exists, it will find a way to rebuild and start consuming again. This has to end here. The Final Protocol weapons were unlike anything that had ever been deployed in galactic warfare. Combining human relativistic kill vehicles with veil theory matter manipulation technology and Thackeray dimensional destabilization fields, they created chain reactions that would consume the Krovathan worlds from the subatomic level up. As the weapons struck their targets, Lyralii watched 7 civilizations die in silence. The Krovathan worlds didn't explode. They simply ceased to exist, leaving behind empty space where moments before had stood monuments to the collective's vision of perfection. "It's finished," Marcus said, his voice carrying no triumph, only exhaustion. But Lyralii, connected to his mind through their empathic bond, knew that it wasn't finished at all. In winning the war against the Krovathan, Marcus had discovered capabilities within himself that no human was meant to possess. He had become something that could plan the extinction of entire species and carry out those plans with methodical efficiency. The man she had married for political necessity had evolved into something that terrified even the enemies of civilization. "The Alliance fleet is standing down," reported Admiral Karath. "All Crovathan resistance has ceased. The core systems are empty." As the Alliance ships began their journey back to their home systems, carrying with them the news that the greatest threat in galactic history had been eliminated, Lyralii found herself wondering what would happen when the other species began to truly understand what humanity was capable of. Through the empathic link, she felt Marcus's own growing awareness of this problem. He had saved the galaxy by revealing the true nature of human warfare, but, in doing so, he had made humanity itself into something that other species would inevitably fear. The war against the Crovathan was over. But Marcus Reed, the human who had won it, was beginning to understand that the most dangerous battle still lay ahead. The struggle to remain human in a universe that now saw him as something far more terrifying than any collective consciousness. In the darkness of space, as the Alliance fleet carried its victory home, Lyralii felt her husband's mind beginning to turn toward the next phase of his existence. He had proven that humans could wage total war more effectively than any species in the galaxy. Now he had to figure out what to do with that knowledge. 6 months after the destruction of the Crovathan core systems, the galaxy struggled to understand what peace meant in the shadow of total victory. The alliance that had formed to combat the collective threat found itself grappling with a new reality. They had won the war by allying with a species whose capacity for warfare exceeded anything in the historical record. Marcus stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed Alliance headquarters, watching ships from 17 different species arriving for the victory celebration. Through the empathic link, Lyralii could feel his complex emotions as he observed the careful distance that many delegates maintained when approaching human representatives. Fear, she realized, had replaced gratitude faster than anyone had anticipated. "The Thrakari ambassador has requested a private meeting," Thessarian informed them, his melodious voice carrying undertones of concern. "He wishes to discuss certain security considerations regarding future alliance structure." Marcus turned from the viewport, his expression unreadable. In the months since the final battle, something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The careful diplomat who had first arrived on Vaelthra was gone, replaced by someone who carried the weight of absolute victory like a burden that could never be set down. "Let me guess," Marcus said with dark amusement. "They want guarantees that humanity won't turn our unconventional methods against our former allies." Through their bond, Lyralii felt the bitter truth of his assessment. The same tactical brilliance that had saved the galaxy was now viewed as a potential threat to galactic stability. Several species had already begun developing contingency plans for containing human expansion, despite the fact that humanity had shown no aggressive intentions toward their allies. The meeting with Ambassador Vextar took place in a conference room specifically designed to neutralize potentially dangerous technologies. The Thrakari diplomat, his crystalline form flickering with nervous energy, had brought with him representatives from 6 other species, all of whom had one thing in common. They were terrified of what they had helped create. "Captain Reed," Ambassador Vextar began, his translated voice carrying careful formality. "We want to express our gratitude for humanity's role in defeating the Crovathan threat. Your tactical innovations saved countless lives across the galaxy." Marcus nodded politely, but, through their empathic link, Lyralii felt his growing impatience with diplomatic niceties. "I sense there's a but coming, Ambassador." "Indeed there is." Vextar activated a holographic display showing human fleet movements over the past month. Several member species have expressed concern about humanity's continued military activities. Your ships have been observed conducting what appear to be training exercises using technologies developed during the war. The display showed human vessels practicing formations that incorporated the same reality-bending weapons that had devastated the Crovathan fleet. It was, Lyralii realized, exactly what any responsible military force would do after a major conflict: analyze their new capabilities and integrate them into standard doctrine. But, to species who had witnessed the complete annihilation of the Crovathan civilization, it looked like preparation for the next war. "You're asking us to disarm," Marcus said, his voice carrying no accusation, only statement of fact. "We're asking for reassurance that humanity's impressive military capabilities will not be turned against species that have been your allies," replied Counselor Yara of the Selenite Confluence. The weapons you developed during the war could destroy entire civilizations. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's flash of anger, not at the request itself, but at the fundamental misunderstanding it represented. These species had witnessed human warfare at its most effective, but they still didn't comprehend the psychology that drove it. Counselor, Marcus said carefully, you're operating under the assumption that humans wage war for conquest or expansion. You've studied our tactical methods, but you haven't understood our motivations. He manipulated the holographic display to show the human colonization patterns over the past century. Unlike other species that had expanded aggressively to claim resources and territory, humanity had grown slowly and carefully, establishing self-sufficient colonies that contributed to the greater human community without displacing existing civilizations. Humans don't fight to acquire, Marcus explained. We fight to protect. Everything we developed during the Crovathan War was created for one purpose, to ensure that the things we care about would never be threatened again. And what happens when humanity decides that other species pose a threat? Asked Ambassador Vextar. The question hung in the air like a blade, cutting to the heart of the galactic community's new fear. They had seen what happened when humans perceived an existential threat. They had witnessed the methodical, terrifying efficiency with which humanity could eliminate anything they deemed dangerous to their survival. Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's realization that this conversation represented a crossroads for humanity's place in the galaxy. He could try to reassure the other species, offer guarantees, and treaties that might ease their fears temporarily, or he could tell them the truth about what they were really asking. The honest answer, Marcus said finally, is that you'll never pose that kind of threat to us. Not because you're not capable of it, but because threatening humanity's survival would require you to become something like the Crovathan, a species dedicated to the consumption and conversion of other civilizations. He stood, his movement carrying the fluid grace of someone who had learned to fight in zero-gravity and three-dimensional battlefields. The weapons we developed weren't created to conquer galaxies. They were created to kill collective consciousnesses and reality-consuming plagues. Unless you're planning to become either of those things, you have nothing to fear from us. The delegates exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their ongoing concerns. They wanted guarantees that human nature itself would never change, promises that a species capable of developing recursive viruses and relativistic kill vehicles would always use those capabilities responsibly. What we're asking, Counselor Yara said carefully, is for some form of external oversight of human military development. A joint council that could monitor and approve new weapons research. Through their bond, Lyralii felt Marcus's instant and absolute rejection of the proposal, but his response was carefully measured. No. The single word carried such finality that several delegates visibly flinched. I understand your concerns, Marcus continued, but you're asking us to put our survival in the hands of a committee. That's not how humans work. We take responsibility for our own defense, and we accept the consequences of our choices. Ambassador Vextar's crystalline form flickered with agitation. Captain, surely you can see how this appears from our perspective. Humanity possesses weapons that could destroy any of our civilizations within hours. We need some assurance that you need to understand something, Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded fleets during the war. The weapons we developed weren't created in a vacuum. They were responses to a specific threat that required specific solutions. We didn't build them because we wanted to. We built them because not building them meant watching everyone we cared about die. He activated his own holographic display, showing the progression of human weapons development during the Crovathan War. Each innovation had been driven by tactical necessity, created to counter specific enemy capabilities or exploit particular vulnerabilities in the collective consciousness. Every weapon we developed was a tool designed for a specific job, Marcus explained. When the job was finished, we stopped developing new tools. What you're seeing in our current training exercises isn't preparation for conquest. It's integration of emergency capabilities into our standard defensive doctrine. Lyralii watched the delegates process this explanation, and, through her empathic abilities, she could sense their continued skepticism. They wanted to believe Marcus, but they had seen too much of human tactical thinking to accept simple reassurances. Perhaps, suggested Counselor Yara, humanity could demonstrate its commitment to peaceful coexistence by sharing some of these technologies with the broader galactic community. If all species possessed similar capabilities, it would create a balance of power that, Absolutely not, Marcus said, his voice carrying such force that the room fell silent. You just finished asking us for oversight of our weapons development, and now you want us to proliferate the same technologies you're afraid of? Through the empathic link, Lyralii felt Marcus's growing frustration with what he perceived as fundamentally flawed thinking. The other species wanted humanity to be simultaneously less dangerous and willing to make everyone equally dangerous, a logical contradiction that revealed their continued misunderstanding of human psychology. The weapons we developed work because they were created by minds that understand the psychology of warfare, Marcus explained. Give relativistic kill vehicles to a species that views conflict as a game of territorial expansion, and you'll get galactic genocide. Give recursive viruses to a collective consciousness, and you'll get something worse than the Crovathan. He moved to the viewport, gazing out at the assembled fleet of Alliance vessels. Each ship represented a civilization that had survived the Crovathan threat by allying with humanity, but now viewed their saviors as a potential danger. This is the problem with being effective at warfare, Marcus said quietly. Success creates fear, even among those you've protected. You want guarantees that will never become a threat, but the only guarantee I can give you is that we'll continue to be exactly what we've always been, a species that will do absolutely anything to protect what we value. The meeting concluded without resolution, but through the empathic link, Lyralii could sense that something fundamental had shifted in galactic politics. The alliance that had defeated the Crovathan was fragmenting along lines of fear and misunderstanding. In the weeks that followed, several species began developing their own unconventional weapons programs, attempting to match human capabilities through technological innovation. Others started forming defensive pacts specifically designed to contain potential human expansion. A few, led by the Selenites, proposed the creation of a galactic government with the authority to regulate military development across all member species. Marcus observed these developments with the same analytical detachment he had applied to studying Crovathan tactics. Through their bond, Lyralii felt his recognition that humanity's demonstration of tactical superiority had inadvertently triggered an arms race that could destabilize the galaxy. They're making the same mistake the Crovathan made, Marcus told her one evening as they watched the sunset over Valethra's crystal spires. They're trying to match human capabilities by copying human methods, without understanding human motivations. What do you think will happen? Lyralii asked, though she could already sense his assessment through their empathic connection. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his mind processing possibilities and probabilities with the same systematic approach he had applied to military planning. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. They'll create something worse than the Crovathan, he said simply. Species that were never meant to develop total war capabilities will arm themselves with weapons designed for species that understand the moral weight of absolute power. Some of them will use those weapons irresponsibly. Others will be consumed by the technologies they've tried to master. Through their bond, Lyralii experienced his vision of the galaxy's future, a series of escalating conflicts as species struggled to match human military effectiveness while lacking the psychological framework that made such power sustainable. It was a future of recursive arms races and civilizations that destroyed themselves in pursuit of the ability to destroy others. And what will humanity do when that happens? She asked. Marcus's smile was sad and entirely without humor. What we always do, he replied. We'll protect the things we care about, regardless of the cost to ourselves or anyone else. In the months that followed, Marcus began the most challenging phase of his transformation from war leader to something else entirely. He established the Human Defense Doctrine, a comprehensive framework that would guide humanity's military philosophy for generations to come. But, more importantly, he began the process of teaching other species how to responsibly wield the power they were so desperately trying to acquire. Through carefully structured exchanges and joint training programs, human military advisors began working with alliance species to develop defensive capabilities that matched their psychological and cultural frameworks. It was slow, patient work that required Marcus to function simultaneously as strategist, diplomat, and teacher. But the most significant change came in his relationship with Lyralii. The empathic bond that had begun as a political necessity had evolved into something that transcended the boundaries between species. Through their connection, she experienced the full depth of human protective instinct, while he gained access to the long-term thinking and emotional wisdom of the Veil theory. Together, they began developing what would become known as the Balance Doctrine, a philosophical framework for managing technological power that recognized both the necessity of defensive capability and the moral obligation to use it responsibly. It was a doctrine built on the understanding that true security came not from the ability to destroy threats, but from the wisdom to recognize which threats were real and which were born from fear. The galaxy that emerged from the Crovathan crisis was forever changed by humanity's demonstration that total war could be waged by species with the moral framework to wield absolute power responsibly. But, perhaps more importantly, it was a galaxy that had learned to distinguish between strength and aggression, between capability and intent. Marcus Reed, the human who had saved civilization by revealing the true depths of human warfare, spent the rest of his life ensuring that the lesson was never forgotten. He remained a living reminder that the most dangerous species in the galaxy was also the one most committed to using that danger in service of protecting others. When he died, decades later, his funeral was attended by representatives from every species in the Alliance. They came not to mourn a conqueror or celebrate the death of a threat, but to honor a teacher who had shown them that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction was necessary, and the courage to accept responsibility for that choice. Lyralii, who had shared his thoughts and emotions for more than 30 human years, delivered the eulogy that would define Marcus's legacy. He was a mortal who fought like a god, but, more importantly, he was a god who chose to remain mortal. In teaching us how to wage total war, he showed us why we should never want to. In demonstrating the depths of human capability, he revealed the heights of human responsibility. The galaxy would never again face a threat like the Crovathan, but it would also never forget the species that had proved capable of ending such threats permanently. Humanity's gift to the universe wasn't just the tactical knowledge of how to fight collective consciousnesses and reality-consuming plagues. It was the moral wisdom to know when such knowledge should be used, and the strength to accept the burden of that responsibility. In the end, Marcus Reed's greatest victory wasn't the destruction of the Crovathan civilization. It was the preservation of his own humanity in the face of absolute power, and the successful transfer of that wisdom to a galaxy that had learned to distinguish between those who possessed the capability for total war and those who possessed the judgment to wield it wisely.